Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. Today's will be a very interesting discussion, I guess, because we have as a guest Tobias Harris, that is political risk analyst and vice president of Teneo Intelligence. And the topic of the discussion will be mostly the U.S. Japan relationship, but Harris is an expert of Japanese politics also, so I'm sure that from the floor there will be many questions also regarding the current development in Japanese politics. My name is Stefano Carrere. I'm a journalist for the Italian economic daily newspaper Il Sole 24 Ore, but I would like to leave to Harris for a speech, and then I will open a Q&A section starting from the professional press. So please put your mobile phone in a mode and give a warm welcome to Tobias Harris.
Thanks for that introduction. It's good to see some familiar faces here. It's been a number of years since I've spoken here, and I really should thank Martin Koling for making this happen. He suggested it, and it's a good time for it. I really want to make sure there's enough time for questions, just because it is a great time to be doing a broad overview of where things stand, both between the U.S. and Japan, but also domestically, which is really, as Stefano said, is what I'm more focused on. But I'll just give some fairly brief remarks and an overview, and then we'll launch right into it. So on the U.S.-Japan relationship, I think the number one thing to note is, in some ways, it's not actually appreciated just how strong the U.S.-Japan relationship is as Obama faces the last half a year in office. I don't think, for example, he would have gone to Hiroshima if the United States and Japan weren't in a uniquely close relationship. In some ways, it's the for the same reason that Abe was able to speak to Congress last year, for example, you could have this historic moment for Obama going to Hiroshima, and I think it's a symbolic moment of just how much the U.S. actually needs Japan right now, and maybe it's not the most the U.S. has ever needed Japan. Obviously the Cold War had its own issues on that front, but looking at the region and looking at a region where you're trying to update institutions that have existed for close to 70 years and try to both answer the challenges posed by China, but also find a way to accommodate increased Chinese power in the region. You need, the U.S. needs a Japan that's willing to play a more active political, economic, and to some extent military role. And I think Abe deserves credit for that he is, in many respects, answered the call. And really, I think the most visible sign of that, I think, is the role that Japan is carving for itself in Southeast Asia. And that really is the test, and it's really where I think the future of the region is going to be determined. So I think, seeing how both the U.S. and Japan are adjusting their relationship in regard to Southeast Asia and carving out roles for each other, again, not just in the military realm, but also thinking more about infrastructure investment and helping the middle-income countries of Southeast Asia get over the middle-income hump. That really is going to be the challenge, and they're going to look to China, but I think they're also going to look to Japan. They're also going to look to the United States. So that means going forward, that really is the big question, right? Because when we talk about Southeast Asia, we talk about development, of course, as far as the U.S. concerned, the U.S. answer to that is TPP. And unfortunately, any progress on TPP is at the mercy, really, right now of the Republican leadership in Congress. And unfortunately, I think whatever window there was for passing it during the lame duck session after the election in November, I think is starting to vanish. And I think largely because the United States is in a extremely unusual moment when it comes to thinking about its relationship with the world. And with that as a caveat, I don't think most voters, for example, are rallying to Mr. Trump because they share all of his policy ideas or they share his exact vision for the world. But nevertheless, I think we're facing certainly a risk that when all is said and done in November, that you could have a president who does not appear to believe in the post-war liberal order, and certainly not in Asia, and has, consistently for 30-something years repeatedly questioned the value of the U.S. Japan relationship, the U.S. Korea relationship, and I don't see any reason why we shouldn't take him at his word. He says lots of things. You never know what, from one day to the next on a lot of different issues what he actually believes or what he's actually going to do. But this seems to be the one policy area where for 30 years he's been pretty consistent and has said the exact same things. I mean, it should be said that we actually, I think, have no real idea how a Trump administration would work and who would staff it. I mean, he's got, if anyone knows who's going to fill the 2,000-something political positions that a president has to fill in a Trump administration, let me know, because I don't think anyone really has a good idea, and certainly on the foreign policy side. But nevertheless, I mean, if Trump is elected and if he finds himself, if he's making U.S. foreign policy, because I have to imagine that any major foreign policy decision is going to go through him. I think Tokyo's the sort of nightmares that we're starting to hear from Japanese officials, and I think they're legitimate. And I think the idea that you might see, for example, a U.S. Japan condominium, where the U.S. or rather a U.S. China condominium, where they divide up responsibility for the region and they strike a deal. I think for someone who views the world through deal making, and both views the world through deal making and also views U.S. allies as free riders who need to be shown a lesson, basically, that's a bad combination. And I think it's a real risk, and I think it's something that has to be taken seriously. Now, all that being said, I actually still think at this point that the chances of his election are pretty unlikely. Obviously, everyone, I think, is overcorrecting because they understated his chances of winning the Republican nomination. But at the end of the day, you're looking at a very different electorate in the Republican primary field than you are in the U.S. general electorate. And I think that you have to look at the United States, the American people elected Barack Obama twice. And to go from that to electing Trump when demographically, if anything, America is even more friendly to the Democrats than it was in 2012. I mean, Trump has an uphill battle, and that's even before you get into the fact that he's the least well-liked candidate in the history of the United States. So I think it's important to be sensitive to the scenario, to what could happen if he were elected, but I think it's important to not go overboard in thinking about the concern, the risk that he could actually take power. So I'm going to just shift gears to the Japanese domestic political scene, because thinking a lot more about that. Obviously, tomorrow we're going to get a consumption tax decision. That's really been the will he, won't he debate is finally over, and we'll see a 2.5-year delay. Obviously, I think as far as the upper house election is concerned, I think this issue is a wash. I mean, the fact that the opposition came out and said, we'll support delaying 2 years, I mean, there's no advantage really. And on top of that, I think the opposition's response to the consumption tax delay is unlikely, I think, to make much of a difference. I mean, obviously, they've come out and said, well, because Abe had to delay, this is a sign that Abenomics has failed. I don't think that's going to change any voters' minds. I think that if that were, we would see, if you look at the polls, we've seen Abenomics' support gradually decline over time. And now you see, in every poll, its disapproval rating is higher than its approval rating. And yet, at the same time, Abe's numbers have continued to drift up, and if anything, the Minshinto numbers have drifted down. So if they were able to actually capitalize on some of that disaffection with Abenomics, I think we'd start seeing some turn. But now here we are 5 weeks away from 5 weeks away from an election, and there were just polls that came out that showed Abe back up above 50. So that, I don't quite know how the opposition is going to go about really making headway in this election. I think they face an enormous challenge. I mean, I think, that being said, I think the tie-up between Minshinto and the Communist Party, I think will yield some seats on the margins, and I think it might limit the upside for the government. But we're not going to see major gains by the opposition against the government. I think they're going to come out of this. I mean, basically, because you have the argument that I think has supported Abe this whole time, that as long as you're getting stable leadership, it might not be inspiring leadership, and might not be resulting in policies that the public is particularly interested in, but it's meant an end to the years of divided diets. It's meant an end to the revolving door premiership. And I think if there's one thing the Japanese public wants right now, that's it. And I don't think that's going to be forever. I think at some point, they will get exhausted with a government that doesn't seem to share their priorities. I mean, it's always funny to look at the polling, and the support is high, and then you look at the breakdown of each policy issue, and the government is on the wrong side of the public on pretty much every issue, and the issues they are on the same side tend not to be that important. So we are in this unusual situation where I think the public, without much love for Abe himself, is ready, I think, to at least maintain the status quo, if not give the LDP. I mean, they need only 8 seats for their own majority. I mean, that's certainly within reach, if not a guarantee. So that's, I mean, if anything, this is going to be, in some ways, it'll be a boring election campaign. I mean, I don't think we're going to see too many surprises. I don't think Min Shin-to has the formula at this point in time. And it'd be a very interesting discussion if we wanted to have later in the hour about what exactly Min Shin-to can do to save itself. I mean, I have some thoughts on that, but I think it's going to be a long road back, and it could be a number of years before we really see a viable alternative opposition, party that can actually be trusted with government. So, looking past the upper house election, I mean, then I think we have to ask ourselves, what happened to the Abe government? So, after July, and maybe the discussion should really be after the end of this year, assuming that if the rumors are true that there might be a snap election later this year. But whether there's a snap election later this year or not, we're still in a situation where Abe is not going to have to face voters until 2018. And, in theory, there could be a party election that year, but if they change the rules, maybe he'll extend his term and he really will have more time. And so the question now is, what can he do? It seems like he's out of excuses for when it comes to tackling some of the harder economic challenges that I think his government has to face. That I think at every turn, they've managed to come up with some excuse for why, we have these plans for reform, we have these plans for tackling the longer term fiscal challenges, or for boosting productivity, labor market reform, and so on. But in 2013, we had an upper house election, we couldn't do it then. And the last couple of years, we had security legislation. That's much more important. We're going to have to punt on the reform bills. This year, another upper house election. So the question is, he's out of excuses, and so how? I mean, is he going to make good on some of the challenges that he said? He came into office saying Japan is facing a crisis, we have to overcome it. Is he going to be able to get that energy back? Is he going to be able to do something about boosting productivity? Is he going to be able to do something about real labor market reform, not the kind of tinkering around the margins? Are we going to see, he's ruled out discussion of immigration reform in the past, but is that going to come back on the table? I mean, I'm pessimistic. I mean, I think that, it wasn't an accident that he found excuses for this. That I think that as a politician, I think he's timid by nature. I don't think he has a strong desire to tackle economic issues. I mean, he's very different than Koizumi when it comes to that. And I think there's also, beyond that, and beyond kind of Abe's interests, his ideas, his qualities, there's a paradox of having a strong government. That you have all this political capital, and I think the more you have, the more loath you become to spend it and to jeopardize it and to put it at risk. And so you're in this situation now where stability becomes its own goal. That rather than having a stable government that can then accomplish things, that can move things through the diet, you have a stable government whose main goal is preserving its stability and doing nothing to challenge that. And I think if you look at the growth strategy they put out and the Ichioku plan they just put out, it's all focused on things that are pleasing to voters, but not actually doing anything that would jeopardize the government's support. And so I don't know if after the election that they'll go back to the drawing board and maybe they'll feel more confident and more inspired to tackle some of the harder issues. But I don't see much reason to hope for that. And so then there's a real question of how much more patience will the public have in terms of waiting for the economy to get moving. How much more time are they willing to give Abe? I mean, I suspect he'll make it till the end of his term in 2018, but after that, I mean, whether the LDP even is still willing to give him a chance, whether or turn to someone else. I mean, I think that's going to be an open debate, and the closer we get to 2018, the more questions about party discipline I think we'll start facing. So I mean, Abe's had this window of time where the LDP has been uniquely tamed, been uniquely calm, and been willing to follow Abe's lead, but at some point, he's going to run out of time, and he's certainly going to run out of excuses, and that really is, I think, the big questions facing Japan going forward. So why don't we throw it open to questions now, or if you want to start, pick up on any of that.
Thank you very much for your very interesting introduction. So I will open the Q&A section. Please raise your hand and state your affiliation and come up here at the mic. First, the professional press. Okay.
Siegfried Knittel, writing for the Austrian newspaper, the Standard. It seems to me in the first year when Prime Minister Abe was in office, when he first met President Obama, the relation was not really good. At one point might be Abe's visit of the Yasukuni shrine, but I think what I had my feeling, the real reason was Obama has a very different kind of thinking, kind of political philosophy than Abe. Now it seems to me all these differences has vanished. Why? Is it only on the political situation in East Asia? Is it and is it really necessary only perhaps of this political situation in East Asia that Abe can all forget his kind of real differences he has to Abe? So why changed Obama his mind?
And really, actually, I think even as recently as the sushi summit they had, I think, what was that in 2014? Yeah. I mean, I think with Obama, it's always, he's always willing to look bigger than the personal relationships he's had. I mean, everything one hears that he doesn't have the same sort of investment in personal rapport that say Bush had, or Bush sought with his counterparts. No, I mean, I think it's entirely beyond personnel. I mean, I really think it is an appreciation in this administration that the rebalance isn't just about the U.S. reasserting its primacy in Asia. In a lot of ways, it's investing enough energy, time, resource, manpower, material in the region to preserve stability, but also at the same time to give encouragement to its allies to do more. And I think this administration over time has come to see Japan basically as the deputy of the rebalance, and essentially has called upon Japan to live up to that role. And in a lot of ways, Abe has. I mean, and I think getting, the Obama administration was very understated, I think, compared to its predecessors in the collective self-defense debate. And I thought last year when Abe was in Washington, one of the best messages I think Obama gave in that press conference was him saying, that ultimately it's a domestic political matter for Japan. I mean, the U.S. has its thoughts on the matter, but the Japanese people have to decide for themselves. Which, I mean, it should be a basic thing for a U.S. president to say, but it was for me, I thought it was such a relief from some of the pressure I think you got from U.S. leaders in the past, public pressure on issues like this. But I think it's a maybe an understated sort of appreciation for just how much Japan has answered the call that the U.S. has needed when it comes to pursuing stability in the region. So I don't think we need to look for a personal explanation. I think it really just is about policy.
But Abe is not delivering too much on Okinawa issue. I mean, do you think that the Henoko bases will be really built? Because especially after this recent unfortunate incident, I mean, I wonder if the process of shifting from Futenma to Henoko will go on.
I mean, I've been skeptical about it for years. I mean, I remember 10 years ago now, when I was working for a Diet member, I did some research on the relocation plans and how the U.S. was planning on paying for it and so on. And I mean, it is amazing, that how that goal has slipped. And yeah, I think on the U.S. side, I think there's maybe not a public appreciation yet, but I think there's a private sense that the plan as it is written, as it was agreed upon, is not going to happen. And at some point, whenever, I mean, I don't think anyone's willing to admit when that's going to be, but at some point there's going to be a discussion about finding some sort of plan B. And, ideally, the sooner they figure that out, the better. But I think I think the U.S. will try to do do what it can on the Guam end. It's going to move people to Australia. I think, but at some point the status quo is just not going to work. And I, unfortunately, I think on the U.S. side there's still not enough of an appreciation of what the situation on the ground is in Okinawa. And the fact is that, I mean, the Okinawans, it's not about money. It's not about, that they're pawns of China, as some people say. I mean, it really is about, there were decisions made when they were a colony. They're not a colony anymore, yet they still feel like they're treated like a colony. And some people in Washington get that, but it's taking, I think, a long time for that realization really to sink in. But, I mean, I don't see the current plan ever being done.
Okay. Other questions? Regarding the domestic policy, I mean, because I went to Sendai, the G7 summit of the financial minister and governors of the Bank of Japan, and I felt a little bit cheated because from the officers of Zaimusho, I mean, the message was in some way, yes, the consumption tax increase will go on as scheduled, but then Prime Minister Abe at the G7 summit in some way dramatized the situation of the world economy, probably to get a cover, international cover to delay. And it seems, according to the latest rumors and reports, that not everybody inside the Jiminto agreed with this delay. Maybe Aso, Tanigaki, or Inada, and so on. How seriously can we take this apparent rift?
Well, so, I mean, back in 2014, I mean, the debate about the consumption tax in some ways is the reason why Abe called an election in the first place. I mean, it was as much about the rift within his own party as anything else. But I think I was convinced from very early on that he was going to delay. And, both because I don't think Abe had any personal commitment to it happening. I don't think he has the fiscal hawk leanings. I think his closest advisors are, they don't really use this term anymore, but 10 years ago it was the rising tide school. That's his advisors. They come from those ranks. I think in 2014 the fiscal hawks pressured him into a stronger commitment maybe than he wanted to, and so the question has always been, how is he going to wriggle free of that commitment? And frankly. It's almost silly. I mean, how easily he did. I mean, talking about using the code word Lehman shock and then using it over and over again when no one believed. I mean, no one. Even if you think that there's a global demand slowdown and there are downside risks. I mean, it's a long way from saying that it looks exactly like Lehman. I mean. And the fact, it's a little embarrassing that he felt the need to go through this whole song and dance about how, well, the condition, according to these metrics, it looks exactly like 2008. But it was always just a question of how was he going to make the case. And, it helps that 70% of the Japanese people support it, that support delaying. In some ways he might have been able to just leave it at that and, and say, like, look, this is not the time to do it. Getting growth in the near term is a lot more important than the fiscal target or dealing with fiscal reconstruction. That time will come down the road. We can't kneecap growth now, and we'll deal with it down the road. I'm the prime minister, and essentially that is what he did. But the fact that he had to go through this song and dance routine at the G7 is, it shows you that there's still some residual power for the fiscal hawks. They still have, some ability to push back and to pressure the prime minister. But the fact that he was able to get away with it the way he did shows that they don't have the power that they used to have. And if anything, the interesting thing in this whole debate over the last few months is how I don't think I heard anyone really make an argument for why they should follow through with the tax. I mean, in some ways, I mean, by bringing in Stiglitz and Krugman very early on and kind of making this big public show of having them there, in some ways, Abe stacked the intellectual deck. I mean, the arguments against raising it were made so strongly up front. And, I mean, the arguments for sticking to it were basically just, well, the economy's not that bad. So, and, we committed to do this, and so we should do it. And, obviously we have, we have a fiscal target. There's, we're trying to, shrink the deficit, so we should do it. But no one ever, this isn't like back in the early part of the decade when they first came up with this plan in the first place, it was all about Greece, and it was all about, the specter of a serious financial crisis in Japan, and, what could happen. And I didn't hear anyone talking like that. No one was painting a doom and gloom scenario to try to sell this. So, I mean, in some ways, the fiscal hawks almost gave up the fight before it started. I mean, everyone just kind of went through the motions. And it's a little surprising that Abe got 2.5 years, although it does seem that the half is as much about politics as anything else. But nevertheless, I mean, it never really seemed in doubt to me that he was going to be able to get his way.
Thank you. Okay, please.
Nicholas Smith from CLSA. A couple of things. First of all, what has caused the breakdown in power of the Ministry of Finance? It's been incredibly powerful for at least the 30 years I've been here. And secondly, is Kuroda going to get fired? He's been dragged in front of Parliament 37 times, which is more than in any year back to 2002 that a governor of the Bank of Japan's been in front of Parliament. Is there anything you've heard that can shed some light on that?
On the first question, I mean, part of it is just part of it is where power resides now, which is in the Prime Minister's office, and that Abe has no love for the Finance Ministry, has no real historical attachment to it, doesn't see the world the way the way they see it. And I mean, obviously, the flip side of that question, of course, is that is the rise of METI as kind of the powerhouse behind this government. And you look at who's wielding power in the Conte. A lot of it's coming from METI, and so a lot of it's just the personal preferences of the Prime Minister combined with the fact that you have vastly expanded institutional prerogatives of the Prime Minister, and that has given him the ability to ignore the Finance Ministry in a way that maybe his predecessor certainly didn't feel confident enough to do. And certainly look at the DPJ. DPJ Prime Ministers, I think, didn't have enough confidence in their own beliefs, I think, and did not have an alternative source of advice to turn to in the way that Abe has had. And as a result, I think they found themselves more at the mercy of the Finance Ministry and bought into their view of the world, I think, a lot more than Abe has. As for the second, I mean, I certainly haven't heard anything about Kuroda being fired, and I mean, not anything seriously. I mean, I see you laughing. I think for Abe to do that, I think you want to talk about an admission that Abenomics has failed. I mean, canning Kuroda would be it. I mean, and I think obviously he's got 2 years left in his term. I mean, I don't think there's any urgency in replacing him. I don't think they're prepared to give up on him yet or on his program. But I mean, if you know something that I don't know, I'm happy to hear it.
Okay, but how is please?
I won't use the mic if that's possible. It's Melanie Brock. I've just got two questions. And
Sure.
I apologise, I was a little late, so I don't know if you've already addressed this. I'm keen to, we all hear the rumours about the beauty portfolio starting earlier.
Right.
And I heard it, like late August or September. And the first thing will be a cabinet reshuffle. I'd love to hear your views on who you think's going where and how. And also then legislation that will keep them busy until they play around with possibly elect them
Wait, can you just repeat the very end? I missed.
So just interested to know what legislation's likely to bog them down. I know TPP, you mentioned
Yeah.
just as I
Yeah.
came in. Did
Yeah.
you see that there's anything else? that would come?
Sure. So on the cabinet reshuffle side, I mean, I think not without even going specifically into names, I think it'll be the interesting question is what's Abe's philosophy going into that reshuffle? That I think, obviously the past reshuffles, he's made a very deliberate point of keeping kind of the upper tier intact, and that, there was a signal that came from, we're gonna, if we have the same finance minister, foreign minister, chief cabinet secretary, if there's like that, the signal that sent, obviously he believed that was important, and having continuity in those roles was important. Obviously, there's all sorts of speculation now about who's going to be out. That maybe this is Kishida's turn to leave, for example. I mean, that's certainly plausible. I mean, but obviously, there's still the question of, if he changes people at the top. If Aso's out, for example, what is that? Who replaces him, and what does that mean in terms of really now that you're going to go into a debate after, with the end of the speculation about the consumption tax delay, and now the questions about can they actually reach the fiscal year 2020 target? Are they going to have to start talking about Social Security spending cuts if they're pushing this back? I mean, there's certainly, I think, going to be pressure from the fiscal hawks to do that. Does Aso say, what, I lost this fight, I'm out, put someone else in? And then the question is who actually gets that role? Is it someone who is going to be as receptive to the finance ministry's view of the world as Aso has been? I mean, Aso obviously has been the finance ministry's man in the cabinet, more or less. So that I think is a big question. Will we see the same continuity in, especially in the finance ministry? I haven't heard any. I remember last year there was some talk that Suga was getting tired and wanted to leave. I haven't heard anything about that this time around. I mean, that obviously is the most important question about personnel in this cabinet. That as long as Suga is in place, I mean, I think their ability to control, especially their ability to control the LDP and its backbenchers, I think is intact. And if he were to decide this time around that he wanted out, I think the next 2 years could get considerably bumpier for Abe. I think a few other people who I'm kind of interested to see what he does, just for thinking about down the road, what the post-Abe outlook looks like. First, I think the question is, I mean, again, last year there was lots of talk about this and he ended up not doing it, but what does he do with Inada? I mean, obviously we all know that he has he wants to see her advance, and I think wants to at least give. I don't think he's in a position where he can foist her upon the party. I think she's too unpopular for that. But nevertheless, is this going to be the opportunity to put her in a position of real authority? I mean, I think that's another interesting question to watch. Another person who, I mean, not this, nothing like the sort of controversy around Inada, but someone who might be due for a more prominent role, and certainly someone I think to watch down the road as a potential contender for the leadership, is Nishimura Yasutoshi. I mean, this is someone who I think has policy chops, kind of has the worldliness, I think, that has become an asset for LDP leaders. And I'm curious to see, I was also wondering last year, was he going to get, he'd been a vice minister, was he going to get a bump up? And obviously he's been doing a lot of work within the LDP over the last year, and so is he going to get an actual ministerial appointment now? Because there aren't going to be too many more of these reshuffles, until we're looking at the next, Abe's replacement. So that, this is really an opportunity to put people in some positions of responsibility. Actually, on that note, too, another question is: are they going to keep Kato in the position he's been in, or is he going to get a proper, sort of a real ministerial portfolio? That I think is another question, because he's another person that maybe more of a policy wonk, and obviously he's done a tremendous amount of work behind the scenes, when he was deputy chief cabinet secretary. Whether Abe decides to favor him with something that's more responsibility, actually running a ministry, I think is another question. So your second question, it's still obviously too early to say anything concrete about, the next session. The first question is what does the supplemental budget look like? Now it sounds like that's actually happening, but maybe tomorrow we'll get some sense of what the size is going to look like, how they're planning on paying for it, what they're going to do with it. But that's obviously the first question. What's going to be in that? How long does it take to get it done, and then how long does it take to pass it? And then TPP. I mean, I was very skeptical that they were going to do it this session. I thought from the beginning. I mean, from the moment they signed it, given that basically they had a 6-week window to do it, and this government has really not been good at parliamentary time management. I didn't think they were going to get it. I thought that it was inevitably going to be postponed. And whether it gets postponed again, I mean, it really depends on the U.S. I think they should probably, if they're going to do it, they should just do it and get it done and not worry about the mercies of the U.S. And, I suspect they'll have enough time in the fall to do it. It'll get the proper, the full airing of criticisms from the opposition and so on. But I mean, I suspect they won't delay. But if the U.S. election, or if we get more signs that, for example, that lame duck passage in the United States is possible. I mean, at this point, I think it's pretty unlikely, and I think the window is closing on that. But if that it could change. There's it's a long time between now and the election, and so there's every reason I think at this point to stick with the plan to do it in the fall. But the winds at this point are blowing in all sorts of different directions.
And according to the latest Kyoto poll, the popularity of Prime Minister Abe has increased 7 percentage points or so in the last month. Do you think that going into the next election, he will actually gain from appearing as the first Japanese Prime Minister that managed to bring a U.S. president to Hiroshima?
I mean, I suspect as far as voting goes, I mean, I'm sure obviously contributed to the bump that he received both in Kyoto but also in the Nikkei and Mainichi polls that were also conducted last weekend, although those bumps weren't quite as big. I mean, look, Japanese voters are pretty straightforward about the kind of things that motivate them to vote for anyone or to go out and vote. And, it's pensions and it's jobs. And, maybe it makes people feel a little better about Abe, but I don't think it's going to be a big driver. I mean, I think the real question, I think, as with past elections, is what is turnout going to look like, and how, just how interested are voters in coming out to vote when, really the stakes aren't that great. That there's not really a real likelihood that the government's going to lose control of the upper house. I think we saw in the Hokkaido by-election that even with opposition cooperation, getting people out to vote is going to be a real challenge, and really. Overcoming some of the apathy that's set in over the last few years where, people aren't terribly enthusiastic about Abe or his policies, but they're not, there's nothing really on the opposition side that excites them either. And, I don't see that changing in the next 5 weeks. So, I mean, I think that really is the real question. And unfortunately, I think it'll be disappointing.
Other questions? Okay.
A question about the G7 summit. So all leaders went to the Ise shrine, and but I think it was Abe arranged it to put the reputation of the Ise shrine in the state Shinto to increase the reputation of it. So in this way, this is kind of a policy to diminish the difference between the state and religion. And I think normally the constitution of Japan, who was brought to Japan from the U.S., it's a game totally against American thinking and against thinking of most other G7 states. Was there not a opportunity to talk in secret with Abe, not to go to the ISE shrine for the G7 leaders?
So I don't know in particular if those discussions happen, but I understand the concerns, but I mean, I think at the end of the day, the separation between religion and the state. I mean, ultimately that's a question for the Japanese people to figure out and to debate amongst themselves. And I mean, frankly, I think we should just be happy that. I mean, he's decided that if he can go to Ise as much as he wants and not go to Yasukuni. I mean, I think that's, frankly, that's better for everyone. I mean, as long as Japan's neighbors don't see a problem with that, it's certainly not an issue internationally. And frankly, at the end of the day, the Japanese people, I don't think the Japanese people are going to allow, the Nippon Kaigi view of look. I mean, you go to the bookstores and the bestseller. There's a book about the dangers of Nippon Kaigi is a major bestseller right now. I mean, I think that's a sign that ultimately Japanese people are pretty sensible, and for all of the right wing's desires to change Japan in all sorts of ways, that I think there's a certain popular resistance, maybe too strong a word, but people aren't just going to be led around just because the Prime Minister wants, a certain vision of Japan to be realized. And, and actually, I mean, it's also, I think, worth stressing while we're talking about this. Like, for example, the Constitution, right? Abe can talk about constitutional revision all he wants. I don't think they're getting to 2/3 in July. And frankly, short of that, I don't know what sort of form of constitutional revision would get 2/3 of both houses and half of the Japanese people to sign on. And so there's more. I mean, although at times it looks like there are insufficient checks on power, and certainly on the power of the central government, there are sources of counterbalancing it. Even if it's just, the Japanese people just will never stand for it, and the government knows that, and there's a certain, limit to how far the government can push before it faces a real reaction. So I mean, I don't think it's that great a concern.
By the way, I was the first journalist, I guess, to break the news that Abe was going to invite the leaders, to welcome the leaders at his shrine. But actually, no other media took my story, so I felt a bit frustrated about how unimportant it is to write in Italian language in this Anglo-Saxon world. But for sure, I knew that, for instance, the French were a bit uneasy about this. Were uneasy about that because they took very seriously the separation between religion and state, and so they made it clear that the chief of the state should not make religious gestures like washing the hands or so on. And so the visit was labeled as a cultural visit, not a visit to a shrine in some way. Please, George.
My name is Baumgartner. I'm working for Swiss television. At the G7, Mr. Abe was forced to say no, the Abenomics have not failed. Aso is saying today, no, Abenomics have not failed. But the outside world already think Abenomics have failed. The investors have left the Tokyo market. Do you think after the elections, Abe will be under pressure from the markets to do the reforms he has postponed, he has never really put in place since he's in power, or not? And how much longer do you think the Jiminto can delay the reforms when the economy is already bust here?
So a few things. So first, on the question of whether it's failed or not, I mean, there are two ways to answer that. I mean, one, as long as Abe's in power, they're going to keep throwing things against the wall and trying to make it work. So, I mean, in that sense, it won't be officially a failure until he's out of office. But I think by Abe's own standard, he came into office talking about this, existential crisis that Japan is facing, and and the fact is that the monetary and fiscal policies were only intended to buy time, and he has not used that time at all. So by that standard, I mean, it's failing if it has not failed. And there are three challenges that I think he needs to tackle, and on all fronts he's been deficient. I mean, one is raising productivity. That fewer Japanese workers means that you have to do more with each worker, and I think the kind of steps that are needed on that front have just not happened. You've had lots of, I mean, if you're reading that growth strategy they just put out, I mean, I've never seen so much katakana-laced, the jargon-laced katakana filling pages and acronyms. I mean, it's just meaningless. I mean, at the end of the day, it's just targets that with no steps to implement them, and goals and ways in which they're going to transform Japan. I mean, the fourth industrial revolution, all of these buzzwords that basically had no policy behind them. And that I think has been all too typical of the last few years when it comes to measures that would increase productivity. So that's the first goal. The second goal is increasing the size of the labor force. And, there has been an uptick of women entering the workforce. There are kind of steps to have more foreign guest workers, but none of this is making up for the fact that more people are leaving every year than are entering. And so that trend has continued. And we're getting discussion now about policies to make more Japanese workers in the future, pro-natalist policies. And we're not going to know if those have worked, for a while. Obviously there was that uptick in the numbers recently, but that, obviously was likely, fact that people who've put off having children maybe are having children now. But, they're nowhere near where they need to be, to achieve their goal of maintaining a population of 100 million by 2050. And, again, Abenomics needs to be assessed by this standard. It's not about, how many, what the employment level is or anything like that. It really is, if we take Abe at his word, this is his goal and this is how we should be assessing his policies. And the progress towards them have not, I think, have been lacking. So, no, there's a real question after this election whether he's going to be able to follow up. As far as pressure from the markets goes, I mean, in some ways the pressure's already been there, right? I mean, you have investors leaving. I think I have to imagine that every discussion that people from this government have with foreign investors revolves around how little they expect from the government now at this point. And I know, talking to people, in the markets, that they don't. No one really expects much of anything on this third era structural reform side. And so on the one hand, maybe there's potential for a surprise that no one expects anything, and maybe they can come up with something that has a little more teeth than anything they've done before. Again, he's got no excuses. There's no security policies to deal with. There are no elections coming up. So if there was ever a chance that he was going to do it, now it's going to be it. But ultimately, it's going to really depend on the ability of the prime minister to take on, to take on interests like Keidanren, for example. I mean, that really is the chance. Is he going to be willing to take on his own party's core supporters? I mean, that I don't know the answer to that yet, and we'll have to see what he comes up with.
Joel?
Hi, Tobias. Joël Lejean, French TV and radio. When I was reading the Japan Times this morning, there was a report from Ayako Mie about the explanation between what Japanese could have felt as apologies and what the American could feel. So I was wondering if, when I was in Hiroshima, in front of this scene, watching the cenotaph and watching Abe and Obama together, I was wondering if I was on the same channel or on the same planet. And exactly for the Japanese, an apology is a kind of formal thing. You have to do it, even if you're the worst crook in a company or whatever. But if you're an American, if you apologize, and you're American, it's something serious. Could have consequences. For example, if you apologized to the Hibakusha, you might restart a process of maybe compensation or something like that. Right. What's your opinion about that?
So, I mean, in terms of, so basically whether it was advisable to apologize or not, or whether it was I mean, for my part, I didn't think it was necessary for the president to do it. I mean, and I think. part of it is just domestic politics in the United States. And obviously, the usual suspects on the right in the United States have criticized, even what he did as an apology. And so in some ways, if he apologized, whether he formally apologized or not, I mean, he was going to, the criticism from the right was going to be the same. And I think, so I think there's that factor. I think the other factor is that you still have World War II veterans in the United States who still have some political power. I mean, certainly not what it was 20 years ago, and I think that's why this visit was able to happen at all. But I think the president was sensitive to that. And finally, I think he was sensitive to his hosts, and I think. I think he was aware of the fact that that he wasn't being asked for an apology by his counterparts. I'm not saying by all Japanese. I mean, there's some Japanese who I think would have, although according to that Kyoto poll, 18%, which isn't a huge number, that 70-something% said they were fine with no apology. And, I think when you start apologizing for dropping the nuclear bombs, it does raise questions of, okay, what about your nuclear arsenal that's defending Japan now? And I think not getting into that was probably better for all parties involved, and just not having a broader discussion over the existence of a U.S. nuclear arsenal altogether. There's and when my thinking going into the visit, and when it was announced, and then thinking about what it would mean and what would be a successful visit in my mind. I mean, the goal really was, for me, I think, that the president had to go there, and, I mean, really the goal was to acknowledge the humanity of the victims of the bombing. And, which I mean, it should be such a basic thing, and yet here we are 70 years later, and it's still controversial in the United States that the president would go and talk about, the humanity of the people who were killed by the U.S. atomic bombs. But even just getting to that point and going there and going into the museum and seeing it, it's an ownership of the act, and it's moving beyond just talking about, was it necessary, was it not necessary, what were the U.S. motives, and kind of setting that aside and saying, look, I'm going to go here, I'm going to, stare the consequences of this in the face. And I think in his speech, that I mean, if there was, a memorable part of his speech, talking about the humanity of the victims. And I think, he can't talk about a nuclear-free world without, being sensitive to the consequences of when they were used by his predecessor in office. And to that extent, I think he succeeded in doing that and acknowledging that. Whether there'll ever be an apology from a U.S. president, I mean, maybe, at this point, probably not. But getting to this point, I think, was a success.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you for the great lecture. I'm Hidetoshi Ozuma from APCO Worldwide in Washington, D.C. About G7. So I think the whole G7 event was an opportunity for Abe to demonstrate what he believes as Japan's global leadership, like diplomacy overlooking the globe, like Chikyu of Kansuru Gaiko, and that sort of stuff. What do you think is coming up next on his foreign policy agenda? We know that Abe will be visiting Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Putin will be visiting Yamaguchi. Where do you think Abe is heading for in terms of foreign policy? Thank you.
In terms of creative, new initiatives, I mean, I think actually, I would guess the main challenge coming up is really what happens after the UNCLOS tribunal makes its decision in the Philippines-China case. And that's going to be a challenge for everyone across the region, and Japan no exception. Given that he's made support capacity building with the Philippines and other countries in Southeast Asia a priority, I think just given that continues to be a real test for the U.S. as well. I mean, whether he wants to make that a priority or not, I think events are going to make that central. And that doesn't necessarily mean, obviously at various points in time we've heard rumors about, Japan patrolling and things like that. I mean, I don't think we're anywhere close to seeing anything like that. I think there's still questions about the constitutionality of that and, what sort of presence Japan can have in that form. But nevertheless, I think in terms of what the priorities are. I mean, that's going to be number one on the agenda, for the foreseeable future, I think.
Okay, so any other question from the floor? Okay, so we almost finished. So thank you very much for your illuminating speeches and answers. And first, I will try to first get a promise from you to come back again.
Sure.
for us, and also I can give you 1 year. 1 year full membership of this club, so you can join the bar, and so you can even informally come, have a drink, and also maybe speak with the people. Please give thanks to him.